Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. You know, January is the National Sanctity of Life Month, and there's a very good reason for that. The anniversary of the unfortunate decision of Roe versus Wade that has led to the death of more than 60 million unborn. We're going to spend some time today, though, talking about what we can do to reach out to those who are abortion-minded, to reach out to those who are unsaved, because we have in studio with us today Mary Margaret Gibson. She leads the Save the Mother, Save Her Child evangelism training, which is an organization tied into Evantel. You're very familiar with Evantel. How many times we had Larry Moyer in the studio over the years. And Evantel's Generational Transformation Initiative is a collaboration with One by One Ministries. And so as we carry on this conversation, I'd love to hear from some of you that work at pregnancy resource centers. Perhaps you have had some experience, or maybe you're working there and would like to know a little bit more about how to use this opportunity, that as you save the baby, you can also save the soul, because there are some great opportunities for that. And I've said on this program many times before, and last time June Hunt was in studio, we agreed that perhaps one of the most effective evangelistic outreaches in the country happened through these pregnancy centers. So I thought you would appreciate this conversation. A little bit later, we'll open up the phones to get your comments. But Mary Margaret, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby. It's just great to be here.
You actually had a 35-year career in the business world. What took you from the business world to then work with an evangelistic ministry?
Well, actually, the way it happened was that I was interested in evangelism for women in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know how to do it. I was very interested, though. I was concerned about women in prison. And I just didn't see a lot of interest on the part of the churches and whatnot in that. And so I took training from Evantel. I went and became a certified instructor for Evantel and learned how to share the gospel with a lot of women, lots of different women. And so in that process, I became pretty interested in what Evantel was doing, and was offered an opportunity to come to Evantel as their ministry director for workplace ministries, because I'd had that background in workplace. And so we really ended up working first on the toughest workplace in the country, I think, one where there are a lot of challenges as far as just operational challenges for running pregnancy centers as ministries, as well as really public organizations. And so it's turned out that the Lord took over, of course, like he always does, and we ended up with a ministry that's very focused and very, it really is, it fits my background perfectly, because I used to build international distribution channels for high-tech companies. And so I guess I'm building distribution channels for the gospel now.
It's just amazing how God uses everything in your life to help you do something else.
He does.
I might also suggest that if you would like to watch the program today, you can, even as you watch it, will notice that we have scattered a whole series of Evantel evangelistic tracks and discipleship resources there. The most famous, May I Ask You a Question, of course, and then, of course, one on discipleship, how to grow as a Christ follower. So those are some resources resources that I want to point you to, but also I want those of you that are working in a pregnancy center certainly kind of sit back and listen, but all of us at one time or another run into abortion-minded women. And what do we say to them? And so we want to give you a chance for a few minutes to kind of sit back and get some training, but I also wanted to point you to SaveTheMotherSaveTheChild.org. We have a link there. Of course, we have other information that we're going to be talking about because it's really key for you to understand this particular issue. And I know in the past you've really kind of joint ventured with CareNet and all sorts of groups because there are this incredible network of pregnancy centers all over the country. And it is amazing to me. I can't think of a pregnancy center banquet I've been to. I don't think there's ever been an exception where I haven't heard not only about children that were saved, but individuals that have come to know Jesus Christ. And I don't know what it is, other than I think once you hit bottom, you have to look up. And there is just an incredible opportunity for evangelism in these clinics, aren't there?
Well, there is. After all, I would have to say that if somebody shows up at a pregnancy center, the Lord sent them, right?
That's right.
So they all know the alternative places to go. So if they're in a pregnancy center, then he has his eye on them for sure. And I think as you look at the work of pregnancy centers, it really does touch all the aspects of a person, the
Sure.
physical, emotional, practical elements of their life and their spiritual life. So you really leave out a big part of the issue if you're not looking at the spiritual side of things.
For sure.
So one of the things that we do coach the centers to do is to declare right away early to the folks who come to the center that they are a full-service center,
Yeah.
that they do look at all the aspects of a person, and that they might have questions for them in all those aspects.
That's great.
And then if a person is not willing to answer questions in any aspect of their life, of course, they just don't answer.
Sure.
If they do and they're interested in hearing more about the spiritual aspects, then you have to assume there's an open door there for that conversation. And so most of our training really is focused on the conversation that they have in the pregnancy center with anyone who comes there, and how that conversation can open a door maybe to some deeper discussion that the person would like to have.
You know, when a woman shows up at the clinic, she may be abortion-minded, but she may not necessarily be abortion-determined. And you've made a distinction there in your conversation. Sometimes we assume more about where she is in her set of circumstances than really we should make as an assumption. True?
Yes. In our way of thinking, an abortion-determined woman is a woman who made a decision a long time ago, before she was ever facing an unexpected pregnancy, that if she did face that pregnancy at a time that was inconvenient to her, that she would abort. That's quite different from a person who's terrified,
Yes.
whose circumstances are really so frightening to them or so dismal that they feel hopeless in their situation, but they are open to the discussion of remedies.
Mm-hmm.
And so if those people do find their way to a pregnancy centers all over the country have a tremendous number of things they can do to help offset the difficulties that a woman and her boyfriend, husband might have.
Sure.
Yeah.
And they might even be pressured by a parent or a boyfriend or something like that. Or they just might say, well, I don't know what the next step is. I don't even know whether or not somebody can rally around me in terms of a community. And so I want to come back after our break and talk about some of that, but also talk about some of the training, because whether we know somebody that is dealing with a so-called crisis pregnancy or whether they're just dealing with a crisis in their life, the information that you have at Evantel will help individuals know how to use those opportunities to share the love of Christ and ultimately come to a gospel presentation and even give them the assurance of their salvation. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Mary Margaret Gibson and encourage you to visit the website, SaveTheMotherSaveHerChild.org. We'll talk with her and you right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the massacre in Paris last week brought out all sorts of comments and commentary. Some of the comments reminded me of this oft-repeated phrase, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Let me focus on the statement by former Governor Howard Dean. He said, I stopped calling these people Muslim terrorists. They're about as Muslim as I am. I mean, they have no respect for anybody else's life. That's not what the Quran says. Europe has an enormous radical problem. I think ISIS is a cult, not an Islamic cult. I think it's just a cult. His first comment reminded me of the lead article in the Christian Research Journal that asked if the Islamic State is Islamic. When you ask the question that way, I think we all know the answer. It's like asking the question, is the Pope Catholic? Obviously, Islamic terrorists are Muslim. Actually, it is his second comment that informs the first. He is convinced that the Quran does not call for jihad or any violence against others. I would encourage him and anyone else who believes that to merely read the verses in Surah 9 in the Quran. Surah 9:5, for example, is known as the verse of the sword. It says, fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem. Surah 9:123 says, fight the unbelievers who gird you about, and let them find firmness in you, and know that Allah is with those who fear him. Other passages in the Quran say that fighting in jihad is good for a Muslim, and fighting is a religious duty. Jihadists believe that these and other verses apply to them today and justify their terrorist actions based upon these verses. Moderate Muslims may ignore these verses or contextualize them, but it just isn't true that the Quran doesn't teach jihad. Sadly, these terrorists who are Muslim use these verses to justify their horrific actions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, we will open up the phones because I'd love to get some of the thoughts about your comments. Maybe you've had some experience of sharing Christ, either with friends, neighbors, or coworkers, but especially in a pregnancy center, and that's what we're talking about today with Mary Margaret Gibson. Again, the organization Save the Mother, Save Her Child. And of course, we also tie that into Evantel, an organization you need to know more about as well. Mary Margaret, let's, for just a minute, kind of sit back and say, well, if we were to be trained, what does that look like? I would hope that some of our listeners who maybe work in one of these clinics that haven't had this training would benefit from it. But how do you kind of take people that are in those clinics through the training? What kind of things do they need to know?
Oh, I can't think of anything I'd rather talk about. The way that we've structured Save the Mother, Save Her Child training is so that people can train a number of people pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. Most centers try to train people at certain times of the year when they have an in-service training for other purposes. So we have two ways of getting trained. One is to take online training, and that's available from the Save the Mother, Save Her Child's website. They can just click on training, and there's a mechanism, just to take them right away to online training. And that's in two pieces. The first is personal evangelism training. The second is Save the Mother training, which is the application of personal evangelism for the pregnancy center setting. So that's one. The second is we have about 85 certified instructors for Save the Mother training around the United States. They work in pregnancy centers. They have a relationship with us, and they teach Save the Mother, Save Her Child training all over this country so that if somebody would like for someone to come in and do the training in person instead of doing it online, they will do that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of centers have sort of a mixed group of people that work there. Maybe some of their volunteers are a little bit computer averse.
Mm-hmm.
And so having their own certified instructor is really very important to those centers, because then they can do their own in-person training on their schedule, not our schedule.
Sure.
So we are, over the last number of years, since 2009 when we launched Save the Mother, Save Her Child, really the number of centers that have begun to use it and use it effectively has grown every year. I say to people that it's like building a bridge with the cars going over it, because the Lord just takes over, and so you end up with lots of folks. But I think we have probably trained there have been 40,000 or so individual training sessions that have taken place. And so pretty exciting. When you think that these centers may see as many, the total number of Save the Mother centers might see 300,000 or so people a year, then you never know how many opportunities the Lord will create for sharing the gospel. We can't do that. We can't manufacture the opportunity.
Yeah.
What we can do is be present for the opportunity and be competent to share the gospel when it happens. So we teach people to listen to the person who's in front of them, not some mythical woman or couple, but the one that's right in front of them.
Yeah.
To understand what their needs are, to understand what their spiritual life is like already, and what their needs might be as far as the gospel is concerned, and to be prepared to step into that conversation about spiritual things with a woman or a couple, so that they really have an opportunity to think this through with somebody who's safe, not going to press them, not going to push the gospel on them, but is going to take the gospel presentation and really tailor the information for them. And I think the best thing about Evantel, as far as I'm concerned, as originally when I looked at Evantel, the very best thing is that the media through which we can reach people with the gospel is really unlimited. But the gospel is incredibly simple. And because it is so simple, the training can be relatively easy to take up, and certainly easy to fit into a conversation that is personal between the person who came for help and the person who's trying to help. So really, it's the people who do this well are people who listen well.
Yeah.
And they understand when somebody says, I think I'm a Christian. And, you can then ask them, tell me why you think you are.
And that's a key point. First of all, the idea of keep it simple. We got Larry Moyer, keep it simple, keep it simple,
Exactly.
keep it simple. He really drives that home. But let's come back to that, because the art of asking questions, I think, is key, because the average person, and we've talked about this with Larry Moyer, how do you get from talking about the football scores or to the gospel? How do you get from, when you have somebody that comes in a crisis pregnancy center, pregnancy resource center, they already are sort of at crisis. Their emotions are already sort of there. So it's not as difficult, but then you still have to be a good listener, as you said, but that comes, I think, with the art of asking questions, right? And
it does.
Give us an idea of what that
it
might
does.
like.
There are a number of ways of thinking about this. What you really are trying to do is create a space in a conversation where the person can tell you what their needs are.
Right.
So you ask questions about things that matter to them and where they are the expert. And in the training, we teach that.
Right.
So that might be their family, which you need to know this information for the intake for a clinic anyway. There are certain things you just need to know about their background, their family, their personal health, etc. And so a lot of those things you learn anyway in that process. But some of the questions need to be focused on that person's spiritual life and their relationships with other people and how they achieved those relationships. Most people are not in a pregnancy center because they've had exceptionally good relationships.
Yes.
Sometimes they've had people who've taken advantage of them.
Right.
Maybe they've had abuse in their life. Maybe they're being coerced in one way or another. There are a lot of things that show up in a pregnancy center. So the goal is to ask those kinds of questions that allow somebody to tell us what it is that they need for us to know.
Yeah.
And one of those questions might be, who do you go to when life is really
very good.
so difficult
Mhm.
and you really don't know which way to turn? Who is the resource?
Yeah. That's a
that
great
you go
question. Yeah.
Because if the person says, "Oh, my mother is fabulous and is doing so and so for me and doing a great job for me," then you can follow that question and say, "Tell me, what is the spiritual life that your mother has,
Mm-hmm.
that defines your mother,
Yeah.
that defines you?" Because ultimately the issue comes down to, what are the relationships and how do they work for the person who is having problems
Mm-hmm.
that's sitting in front of you?
Right.
If there is a resource, praise God for that.
Mm-hmm.
If there is no resource, then they'll need more help, possibly very practical help, a place to live, somebody to help them with their daily bills, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And they may be there for that reason, really. And you might not find out if you don't ask.
And some of these pregnancy centers are providing those kind of resources too. So that's something that they can find. Just before we go to a break, though, it seems to me that one of the hesitations people have is that they might make a statement or ask a question that won't work. Like, well, I want to talk about sin, but if I talk about sin and they're pregnant out of wedlock, how are they going to react to that? So sometimes we have to have a little bit of discernment in terms of the kinds of questions we ask, right?
Yes. And if we do really well about this, if we remember our own sins, that really puts us in a good position to do this.
Right.
Because what we really are all about is grace.
Right.
What else does the
Good.
church have to offer somebody, really? The Lord has a lot more to offer, but we have grace to offer. So I think when we think about how we would approach somebody, there are some cultural issues that have created part of this problem, and maybe after
the break, let's talk about those, because we have a mandatory break coming up. But I also wanted to give some of you a chance to maybe join the conversation today. Perhaps you have worked in a pregnancy center. Perhaps you have some questions about evangelism, or maybe even a testimony. We would love to hear from you. So let's open up the phones. We'll continue our conversation with Mary Margaret Gibson, but we'd also love to chat with you. So that number is 1-800-351-1212. Those of you that work in a pregnancy resource center, we consider you to be on the front lines of the pro-life movement and are certainly grateful for what you do, but also would love to hear maybe some of the stories from the front lines. And if you'd like to share one of those with us, we'd love to hear it as well. 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and talk about some of those cultural issues right after this.
Did you catch Eric Holder on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos? He said the president is planning a summit to study those who, quote, corrupt the Islamic faith to justify terrorism. But since it was Muhammad himself leading the slaughter of men, women, and children for not bowing to Allah back in the 7th century, I wonder if they might discover who corrupted it back then. You know, it takes real effort to ignore the obvious, but it would seem our officials and many in the media make that effort. They can't see that those who take part in terrorist acts are following a straightforward interpretation of Muhammad's teachings and actions and all of the Quran. In a world of political correctness, Point of View Radio stands out. We seek the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and bring it to you daily. But we cannot be here without your support. Give online at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station.
And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Abortion and evangelism are some of the topics on the table today. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Mary Margaret Gibson in studio with us. I might just mention that this organization, Save the Mother, Save the Child, is associated with and affiliated with Evantel. And they really have been, over these many decades, helping Christians overcome the two biggest challenges in evangelism. One is fear, and the other is not knowing how. And so if I'm afraid to do it or I don't know how to do it, well, they answer those questions, I think, very effectively. And Mary Margaret, before we get into the cultural issues you talked about just a minute ago, it occurred to me, what determines the success? In other words, a woman who might have been abortion-minded, who decides to keep her child. And I think certainly running into compassionate people that are willing to meet some of her needs, maybe those who would also educate her about what is in her body.
Yes.
But I think a key part of that is things like a sonogram or an ultrasound. So what makes for success in a pregnancy center?
Yes, I think really it's first of all, you have to find her.
Yeah, for sure.
And you have to find her, and our buddies at Online for Life do a great job of that, working with folks who, frankly, search for abortion online.
Mm-hmm.
And so once an abortion-determined woman is in a pregnancy center, in other words, you've gone through the process of meeting that person and establishing an appointment, and they come, then there's this combination of compassionate care, a sonogram, and hearing the gospel that are great tools in the hands of God for reaching a person who is abortion determined.
Mm-hmm.
But an abortion determined woman has a fundamentally different mindset than someone who isn't. And so usually what you find is that the people who are dealing with a gal who really has sort of made up her mind already are usually the ones who know the most about how to help somebody think differently
Very true.
about their future.
Mm-hmm.
Just think differently about their future and recognize that our circumstances are a lot more in our control than we would like for people to think. And so the people who do really well in the pregnancy center in helping women who are truly abortion determined are mature Christian women who have a great deal of personal desire to see a person not make a serious life mistake that they might later regret. And they have, many of them are themselves post-abortive.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So those combination, we love to see that sonogram, that mature person with a real understanding of what it takes to make a life decision that a person has already decided not to make. In other words, it's really a major mental shift.
Right.
And so people need real support to do that, and we want to give them really good, compassionate care and share the gospel to the extent they'll allow us. And those things really work together. I think we've discovered after a while that people have long-term misunderstandings of what their personal capacity is to absorb difficulty in their life. They just don't understand how they can do it. And they don't see the amount of time that they would designate for, say, carrying a baby to term as being something that is like a hiatus in your life, but it doesn't end your life. It doesn't end your career. It doesn't end your relationships. You can overcome.
Very good. Yeah. We talked just a minute ago about some of the cultural issues, and there are kind of cultural myths and situations that you have to sort of overcome when you're interacting with and talking with some of these abortion-minded women, right?
Yes. The number one issue, of course, is one that I guess the enemy has used since Eve and Adam, which is that you really are only worthy. You're only a person who's worth something if another person says you are. And this is a cultural issue in our sort of sex-saturated culture that causes even young girls to wonder whether they're worth anything if other people are not telling them they're beautiful or if they're not desirable, all that sort of stuff. And so the culture really sets up people for expectations of themselves that are unrealistic and a misunderstanding of what God's role in all this is. Because after all, if God knows us and he designed us and he gives us purpose and he did this long before we were ever born, then we're pretty valuable in God's eyes. and therefore our value can be derived from him as compared to somebody who might not have our best interest at heart. And so this myth that you're not worth anything unless somebody else says you are really affects the whole life movement from before the womb to the tomb.
Very true.
All ages, all races, sexes, etc., are affected by this misunderstanding. And I think it's the one thing that in the pregnancy center is consistent. Well, 100% of the time, this issue is somehow related to what's going on in the person's life.
You can see why a young girl would feel that way, that even if she was attractive to the young man, as soon as she's pregnant, now she's gone from being attractive to a problem. And so her self-esteem, even if it was tied up in her beauty, her success, or whatever, now this crisis has crushed that pretty quickly, hasn't it?
Yes, and I think that really the culture makes it very clear that there's a difference between a person who says yes and a person who says no. That a person who says no to relationships that might be dangerous for them is just a little bit old-fashioned and out of touch and really not much fun. And therefore, depending on the age group that we're talking about, it can be a really very difficult situation to overcome, peer pressure and so on. In the age group where the majority of abortions take place, which is really in the 20s, it's more a matter of career.
Right.
And so that's one of the other
Convenience,
cultural
career. Yeah.
issues is
Yes.
convenience and career and one's one college career and so on. And in fact, there are a lot of things we try to disabuse people of in the pregnancy center. For example, if a person is on an NCAA scholarship, for example, maybe they're on a tennis scholarship or a swim scholarship, they actually believe they can lose their scholarship if they become pregnant.
Wow.
But in fact, they can't. The NCAA has rules for that. The person gets redshirted, essentially.
Yeah.
And they have to get back up to speed, obviously, in their sport. But they won't if they're in good standing. They will be, they'll have that open to them after the baby comes.
Yeah.
But so it's there are interesting things out there, Kerby, that people just don't know.
That's
don't
another
understand.
good reason to get the training. Again, we've talked about that, but again, for people that just joined us, they can have individuals come to the clinic or come to their community. Of course, they have online training as well, just to know things like that.
That's right.
And just before we take a break, let me get one other, because obviously the gospel requires somewhere along the line to explain that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, one of these other cultural myths is well, I'm doing pretty good. I think God kind of grades on the curve, and I'm doing pretty well. One thing that maybe knocks this down a little bit is if a woman shows up at the clinic, she probably doesn't feel so good about herself as she did before. But that's another cultural myth or barrier that you have to overcome, right?
Well, it is, and really, people depend on a lot of interesting things. When you talk to them about how to make sure that they'll go to heaven, how to make sure that they have the help of the Holy Spirit in their life, the power that they need to live every day, and they remember things that they've heard. Sometimes people don't have much of a background in spiritual things, but they remember what they've heard, and what they've heard may not be true. So the question of sin is obviously a universal issue. There's not a single soul living or that has lived other than the Lord who was sinless.
Yes.
So we're on really common ground there. So what we try to do is just to be aware of how to approach the issue from a biblical perspective, because if we can direct somebody toward what the Scripture says, why should they care about my opinion, really? And so if we can direct them toward what the Scripture says, then we're doing the right thing. And we can do that in a way where we can use illustrations that make sense in today's world. So
Very
we can
good.
talk more about that.
Well, we'll take a break, and we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes after the break with Mary Margaret Gibson. Again, the organization Save the Mother, Save Her Child. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
With us for a few more minutes is Mary Margaret Gibson, and if you'd like to join us, we might get to another phone call, but right now we want to focus on maybe some other aspects of discipleship. Save the mother, save her child, and I think there are people, Mary Margaret, that might say, well, this is great that some of these young women and even their boyfriends, husbands become Christians, but there is a need really for discipleship. And of course, you're holding in your hands there one of the best little discipleship pieces that you've put together at Evantel, How to Grow a Christ Follower. But this really kind of connects to the one-by-one ministries, because that's part of Evantel's generational transformational initiative. You really want to connect those people who have accepted Jesus Christ into the church with a mentoring program. Explain, if you might.
Yes. The hardest thing to do, really, is to engage a person who really isn't connected with the church in any way and who is now a new believer. It's very difficult to connect them to the church. And maybe they just don't have any relationships in their life that are connected to a church. Maybe they've had disappointments from the church. So several years ago, we formed a relationship with One by One Ministries, and they have a website, onebyoneUSA.org. And One by One trains and equips church-trained mentors who are women primarily, but also men who mentor the young men.
Very good.
And they actually have a curriculum in parenting and early childhood development. And they help the pregnancy centers to source mentors to walk alongside these moms and dads while they're carrying their baby and all the way into the second year of the baby's life. So that's a nice long time to establish a relationship that sometimes will last a lifetime, really. They've been doing this for a number of years in the Memphis area and San Antonio, and now they are here in the Dallas area as well. And it's a very exciting thing to see a young couple or a young mom find their way to somebody that the Lord has sent to them to help them to learn to take advantage of all the things that the Lord wants to add to their life and understand what an abundant life really means, and then to engage with the church. Actually, the church, all parachurch ministries are there to help the church to fulfill its mission. And so pregnancy centers are essentially an outpost, a missionary outpost of the body of Christ and of the church. And as such, there needs to be an avenue back to the church from the pregnancy center. And so this is an exciting thing, really, to us to see this happen. And so it's growing Christ followers is a personal job.
Right.
And so having a person to do it that connects to the church and to the lots of other people at the church who can provide other things that this family might need is really key to the long-term success of that family.
Let's talk about how to connect people up, because up until now, we've really been talking about how somebody at a crisis pregnancy center or pregnancy resource center can connect up with what you already are making available through Save the Mother, Save Her Child. So
Yes.
I want to talk about that. But it sounds to me we also have a chance for anybody that is in leadership in a church to connect up in a mentoring program. So
Yes.
talk about what that requires in terms of the church, in terms of their dedication. Do they already need to be associated with a pregnancy center? What all takes place there?
Well, it can work either direction. They can go through One by One Ministries, which is easy enough to do, and then One by One can tell them where the churches are that they're working with now and help them get a program in their church. Or they can contact us. They can contact Save the Mother, Save Her Child, which is at Evantel, so they can call Evantel, and most of the time they'll find me there.
Yeah.
And or they can contact their local pregnancy center and ask for more information about a mentoring program. The easiest way, though, I think, would be for somebody to just contact us at Evantel and ask for a connection, and we'll have the one-by-one folks call them. Their website is great. If you go over to the onebyoneUSA.org website, it's fun, and there's a lot of stuff there, video and so on, that people will enjoy as well.
Let's talk about some of the resources that are available at Evantel. Anybody that's been watching online can see all these different tracks and other brochures and resources that are there. There are videos, there are training programs. And I got to mention, since we're broadcasting today not far from the Dallas Safari Club, and they're going to be doing their convention. I remember a year ago, I had the head of Dallas Safari Club and Larry Moyer.
Oh,
and
yes.
Larry is quite the hunter, you might remember.
He really is.
And he's used these wild game feast outreaches, and it's been one of the most effective ways to meet men, especially if they're interested in outdoor hunting, right?
It really is. In fact, the percentage of folks who don't know the Lord is very high, because these wild game feasts, of course, are open to anybody who loves hunting. A lot of men bring their sons or daughters with them who also love to hunt. And Larry is an accomplished hunter. He's not just a person that occasionally hunts. He really
He's serious.
He's serious.
I figured that out years ago.
Yes, indeed. And so the program at one of these is built around all of the actual hunts that he's been on, but also around his testimony,
right?
Because he
Great
came
testimony.
to the Lord through the sport of hunting as a young man, and just enjoying the creation around him and knowing that there was no way that these exquisite creatures could be alive, if there wasn't the hand of God in it. And so that's exciting for us to see this outreach, which is so close to his heart, be as effective as it is. So many people are coming to Christ through this. It's very effective. And so I bet he really enjoyed that time that he spent here with you with the Safari Club. You should do that again. You'd enjoy that.
Evantel's been around for more than 40 years, started in 1973, if I remember right. And it's evantel.org, so that's one of the links. Of course, we've already mentioned Save the Mother, SaveHerChild.org. And, of course, we also talked about One by One Ministry. So you've got lots of possible connection points. And Mary Margaret, I appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you
and
so much. We appreciate it as well. What a fun thing to do. Thanks so much.
Yes. Well, say hi to Larry Moyer and Tara and Tammy and some of the other people over there. Quite a organization that we thought very highly of. And again, for those of you that are interested in learning more about evangelism in general, they have their new evangelism study Bible. Of course, you have information about all these different tools, the evangelism toolbox, all sorts of training and outreach. And those involve everything from, as we said, wild game feast to, of course, the one we've been talking about today, reaching out through evangelism through pregnancy centers. So please take the time to get some of those resources. And again, let me just mention to those of you that are actually involved in what I think is the front lines of the pro-life movement, thank you for your service at these pregnancy centers. As we've said on this program many times before, there are more pregnancy centers in America than there are abortion clinics in America. We're winning the war of ideas. And Mary Margaret, the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life, right?
Absolutely. This is the generation that may make it happen. Millennial people are more pro-life. It's wonderful.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into End Times Prophecy, a fascinating new video out that I think you're going to really enjoy. Joel Richardson will be with us, End Times Eyewitness, and we'll be talking about his video, talking about some of the interviews that he's been able to collect, and I think you will be really shocked at what we've been able to learn just from some of the investigative work that he has done. So we'll talk with him, and then, of course, open up the phones to talk with you. All that coming up right after these important messages.
When you're listening to or watching network news, do you ever start talking to the newsreader or anchor person? Come on, you can admit it, you do, don't you? You can't believe what you're hearing, and you feel the need to correct them. Sometimes you almost feel like you're living in a different world, and you are. People who deny God are living in a world of make-believe. The next time you're shaking your head at the news, I want you to do something. Pick up the phone or write a check or visit us online and give. Point of View brings you a biblically informed analysis of what's happening, but to do it, We need your partnership. Visit pointofview.net and click the link next to Donate Now where it says Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Or mail your donation for this month to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. That's Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Don't just shake your head. Make a difference. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today talking about this new video, End Times Eyewitness, Israel, Islam, and the Unfolding Signs of Messiah's Return. Lots of great material out there. This one is certainly worth your time. I remember watching it and having other people with me saying, is that really true? I didn't know they believed that. What about those things? Does it all fit together? And so I think you're going to find that this is going to be a great conversation on radio, but it is a video that we certainly do commend to you to get. It is published by WND Films, and it is produced by Joel Richardson, who is our guest, and Joseph Farah and others. Joel Richardson, certainly no stranger to this program. He's been on the program before as we've talked about some of his New York Times best-selling books, The Islamic Antichrist, The Middle East Beast. Joel Richardson is an artist, a human rights activist, a New York Times best-selling author, and in addition to writing on all of these issues, producing a very gripping and intriguing video that we're going to spend some time talking about. Joel, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks for having me on again.
Again, congratulations. Very well done. And at one point, to the risk of your own life. I mean, some of the filming you're doing in a riot that breaks out illustrates, again, the dangers that a person doing a documentary film sometimes runs into. So thank you for taking the time to join us today, but also for producing such a great video.
Thank you. Yeah, we certainly did run into some challenges. A big part of the film was to try to capture some of the events that are unfolding in the Middle East since the Arab Spring as they're aligning with biblical prophecy. And, of course, in many ways, the Arab Spring is still unfolding. So as we were traveling throughout the Middle East, there were a few occasions, not only where we did get caught in the middle of some violent episodes, but we also just missed the second revolution in Egypt by a few days. As we flew out of Cairo, the second revolution broke out. It's the largest protest in human history. And part of me was wishing that I was there, and then part of me was grateful that I wasn't.
Yes. And I might just mention that you interview a lot of people, and you don't necessarily agree with everyone, nor do I, because we're not only interviewing Christians in this case, but Muslims and others. We're going to learn about the Mahdi and much more. I kind of broke it down into 8 categories. Maybe you would agree. So let's take some of the easy ones first, because at least this would be familiar territory, and that is when we talk about the end times, the argument that you make is a very powerful one, and that is certainly there have been certain elements that we've seen throughout history, but the rebirth of Israel is a very significant one. And so whether you're talking to a Walt Kaiser, who used to be the professor and even president at Gordon Conwell, and before that at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, or Chris Mitchell with CBN News, Jonathan Cahn, whoever it might be, you are recognizing how that, in a sense, starts the prophetic time clock, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The requisite of the Jews to be back in their land, having reestablished a state, really sets the foundation for the remainder of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And so that's why we began with that issue. You know, it's interesting, Kerby, when you talk to so many of the naysayers, many of those even within the church that love to mock the idea that biblical prophecy has not all been fulfilled in 70 A.D., or those that just think the Bible itself is a joke. They love to point out the various false prophets or the individuals that have made false predictions, Harold Campings and some of these fellows. And there's certainly plenty of those throughout history, but one of the things that I do in the film and we point out, and I've since really researched quite a bit. I've got about 20 different scholars that anywhere from 30 years up to 1,000 years before Israel was reestablished as a state, simply because they took the Bible at a face value, literal hermeneutic, took it for what it says. They recognized that the prophets clearly said that the Jews must be back in the land, having reestablished a state. And so they declared these things with all confidence. And, you know, they weren't prophets, but because they were expounding the words of the prophets, they predicted the future. And so that issue has come to pass. And then we need to be looking for many of these other issues that are beginning to come to pass now. They're beginning to take shape. And, of course, that will come to pass in the days ahead.
Let's see if we can maybe get to that second one, rebuilding the Jewish temple. And one of the individuals you interview there, Rabbi Yehuda Glick, I was in Israel when he was shot. I understand he is doing better now. But again, the chairman of the Temple Mount Heritage Foundation. And here is an individual that is Jewish, wants to actually put the temple, the Jewish temple, on what is called the Temple Mount. And I think people watching some of these interviews might be surprised that there are Jews and Muslims, only a few, I'll admit, but still, that are talking about having both the Dome of the Rock stay up there as well as build a Jewish temple, which I thought was quite intriguing and one of the many very arresting interviews that you did in the video series.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we interviewed Rabbi Yehuda Glick, a wonderful guy, very, very, very friendly, just loving, down-to-earth guy. He's been working for 20 years to promote the right of the Jews to pray up on the Temple Mount. But one of the things that comes out of that interview is that he actually believes that the golden dome of the rock that's up on the Temple Mount, he actually believes, and of course he's not alone in this belief, as I've heard this idea coming from some of the rabbis that are in what's called the reorganized nascent Sanhedrin. This is a group of leading rabbis in Israel. They're trying to reform the Sanhedrin, so certainly not marginal figures. They actually want to see the Golden Dome be used as the heart of the coming Jewish temple, in essence, to put an addition onto the Golden Dome, because they believe that is the spot where the Holy of Holies was. And then the idea is that Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the mosque to the south with the lead dome,
right,
that would be for Muslims, and then the Jews could essentially share the Golden Dome. That would become part of the Jewish temple. And that was a fascinating idea that until just a couple of years ago, I had certainly never heard that. Christians talk about the Golden Dome needing to be destroyed or hit by a comet or something crazy like that. But, this was an idea that you could imagine potentially actually taking place.
Yes. Again, that's just one of at least a dozen things that I found in the video that were new and would be intriguing for you. So let's, again, take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the false prophets, but especially this idea of the Islamic Messiah. This gets into some of the things Joel Richardson's talked about before, the Islamic Antichrist, and we're going to get into the Mahdi and the belief by Muslims that Jesus will return again, but it's not the Jesus we're thinking about. And I think we'll get into those conversations, as well as Daniel 11 and the Arab Spring. How does this relate to Isaiah 19 and Egypt? What about the rise of Islam and the rise of ISIS and the rise of Turkey? Even the rise of global anti-Semitism. There is just a lot that we will try to cover in this hour, and we'll only really touch just the tip of the iceberg, which is one of the reasons why you might want to visit his website, joelstrumpet.com. We have a link on our website. We also have a link for you to order the video and to find out a little bit more about it. We also have a video trailer. And as always, I encourage you to watch the trailer. It gives you at least a little bit of an idea of what's in the End Times Eyewitness video. Then you might click at maybe the share button, put it on your Facebook page, or send it to some other individuals that would like to know about this as well. As you might imagine, we'll open up the phones a little bit later for your comments, but we're going to continue our conversation with Joel Richardson right after these important messages.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the massacre in Paris last week brought out all sorts of comments and commentary. Some of the comments reminded me of this oft-repeated phrase, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Let me focus on the statement by former Governor Howard Dean. He said, I stopped calling these people Muslim terrorists. They're about as Muslim as I am. I mean, they have no respect for anybody else's life. That's not what the Quran says. Europe has an enormous radical problem. I think ISIS is a cult, not an Islamic cult. I think it's just a cult. His first comment reminded me of the lead article in the Christian Research Journal that asked if the Islamic State is Islamic. When you ask the question that way, I think we all know the answer. It's like asking the question, is the Pope Catholic? Obviously, Islamic terrorists are Muslim. Actually, it is his second comment that informs the first. He is convinced that the Quran does not call for jihad or any violence against others. I would encourage him and anyone else who believes that to merely read the verses in Surah 9 in the Quran. Surah 9:5, for example, is known as the verse of the sword. It says, fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem. Surah 9:123 says, fight the unbelievers who gird you about, and let them find firmness in you, and know that Allah is with those who fear him. Other passages in the Quran say that fighting in jihad is good for a Muslim, and fighting is a religious duty. Jihadists believe that these and other verses apply to them today and justify their terrorist actions based upon these verses. Moderate Muslims may ignore these verses or contextualize them, but it just isn't true that the Quran doesn't teach jihad. Sadly, these terrorists who are Muslim use these verses to justify their horrific actions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us today Joel Richardson as we talk about this new video, End Times Eyewitness, Israel, Islam, and the Unfolding Signs of the Messiah's Return. By the way, if you're taking some notes, the first two that we talked about, the rebirth of Israel, the second one, the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. We've already covered a very significant part of the video, but I wanted to get to the third one because that one is certainly most provocative. False prophets and the Islamic Messiah. In some respects, Joel, this goes back to some of your earlier books, but for individuals that have not read your books or not maybe able to remember all the details, talk about this for just a minute, because just as Christianity has an eschatology, a view of the end times, so Islam has a view of the end times, and they believe that there will be a Mahdi, and you can explain who that is, as well as a return of Jesus Christ. But it's not the Jesus Christ of the Bible, is it?
Most certainly not. Most certainly not. So when we look at what Islam teaches with regard to the end of the age, you have two primary Messiah figures, as you mentioned. The first is the Mahdi. In English, we can just say the Mahdi. And this individual comes back as the Caliph. So he will be essentially the Pope, President, and General of the Islamic world, sort of religious, military, political, all wrapped into one office. He'll lead the Islamic world. He'll lead a revival of Islam and victory against the various non-Islamic infidel nations, and he'll cause Islam, according to their prophecies, to be supreme throughout the earth. And in many, many ways, as I point out in the video, when you look at the Islamic traditions concerning the Mahdi, he has many striking similarities to the biblical Antichrist. They actually teach that he will rule the world specifically from the Temple Mount, exactly as the Bible says the Antichrist will set up his seat seat of God on the Temple Mount, proclaiming himself as God, sitting in the seat of God. But Muslims also believe that Jesus Christ will return. They call him Isa al-Masih. And they believe that he essentially comes back, of course, not as the Jesus of the Bible, but as a Muslim. And he'll tell the Christians of the world that they've had it wrong all along. Their Bible was corrupted. It doesn't represent the true faith, which has always been Islam. That Jesus himself was a Muslim. He never died on the cross, never claimed to be the Son of God. And that Islam is the only true religion, that the Mahdi is their caliph, that they need to follow him. And then together, these two will essentially lead the Islamic world in various battles against the Jews and the Christian world and the infidels and so forth. And so in many ways, the Jesus of Islamic eschatology has many similarities to the biblical false prophet that's referenced in Revelation 13. Now, whether or not the Antichrist and the false prophet will actually use these Islamic false prophecies, these false traditions, for their own purposes is yet to be seen. It would be speculation on our part to say that absolutely. However, if we're simply tracking with what's going on in the world, especially the Islamic world, which is supremely relevant to the nation of Israel, then we need to recognize how much the Islamic world is being guided by these prophecies and really how apocalyptic the Muslim world has become. And so when we do that, when we understand their prophecies, we begin recognizing that, for instance, ISIS is a thoroughly apocalyptically driven movement, and these prophecies are guiding them. They believe they're in the last days, and that's often why they have such a sort of make it or break it fervor. This is the final game to them.
And of course, we've talked about Mahmoud Ahmadinejad when he was in power, and Iran and others. There are individuals that believe this, and as you said, ISIS does as well. But another very powerful part of your video were the interviews that you did with some of the Muslims. You obviously had interviewed Adnar Okhtap and some others, but it's, I think, perhaps really helpful for our listeners to watch this if they get a copy of the video and see coming out of the mouth of some of these Muslims. These Muslims really were spending time believing that the Mahdi was going to come, is maybe already here, what he would do, what he would set up. And so they might, in the past, I think a lot of Christians might say, well, Joel, that's what you say, but, what do they say? And you've given us a chance to hear it right from their mouths and to see the sincerity with which they believe it.
Exactly, yes. When I wrote my first book, which covers a lot of these topics, Islamic Antichrist, actually was released a little over 11 years ago. This was one of the criticisms initially that a lot of people had. They said, well, this is only what the Shia teach. This is only the minority Muslim sect. And, I tried to say, listen, I have a vast library of Islamic books written by Sunni Muslim scholars. This is widely held throughout the Islamic world. Certainly not every Muslim, believes these things, just as Christians have varieties within their eschatology, but this is, universally held. And so it was helpful in the video. Not only did we sit down with Adnan Oktar, is the most published author in the entire Islamic world. He's a very moderate Turkish Muslim leader. He believes that when the Mahdi comes, he will help to actually rebuild the Jewish temple, that he'll allow Jews to have sacrifices on the Temple Mount.
Yes.
The other fellow is not moderate. He's the son of the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Sheikh Akrima Saeed Sabri. He's also the president of Quranic and Islamic Studies at Al-Quds University up on the Mount of Olives. And so, again, a Sunni Muslim scholar who this is his specialty. He's the head of the department there. So to have him explain what is standard Sunni Muslim belief on these things, I thought it was exactly as you said, much more helpful to see it from the horse's mouth rather than sort of little old Joel Richardson quoting various Islamic works. And, even beyond that, because we have another film that will be coming out later next year, there's other issues that I will quote Sabri on later. For instance, I ask him, I say, so if a Muslim leaves the faith, what is the proper law for that? What is jurisprudence? And he just says very, very clearly, he says, listen, we give them the option to leave Islam, and if they don't, then they deserve to be killed. And he just kind of smiles. And, if as a Christian I say this, they say, oh, you're just a, Islamophobe or whatnot. But we've got some really amazing quotes that, they just say it very matter of fact. Yeah, if they leave Islam, the punishment is death.
It is just amazing to watch that, and that's, again, some of the kind of education that we need to provide to not only our listeners, but frankly, some of our elected officials. But we'll leave that for another day, because I want to get on to the next point, and that is the Arab Spring. You talked a little bit about the Arab Spring, but you also connect that back to Daniel 11. The Arab Spring turned out to be an Islamic winter. There wasn't the kind of freedom that everybody expected, but you believe that has some connections back to Old Testament prophecy. Could you explain?
Absolutely. When we look at the landscape that the prophets speak of in the last days, just before the return of Jesus, there's various elements of that landscape, of that puzzle, that picture that are coming together now. And one of the more significant pictures, and really it's Daniel 8 and 11, but I primarily focus on Daniel 11 in the film, is that there is this significant conflict between what's called the king of the north and the king of the south. This is Daniel 11, and it's a historical conflict that chapter 11, verse 40 says will be replayed in the last days. And so historically, the king of the north was essentially the ruler of modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and a bit of Iran. That was the Seleucid dynasty. And then the king of the south was essentially Egypt, the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty. And so they were historically in conflict. And eventually you had Antiochus Epiphanes, who's a historical character, the eighth king of the Seleucid dynasty, and he features prominently in Daniel's prophecy. Well, this conflict, this regional conflict, will be repeated in the last days. And really just 2 years ago, you could not say that Egypt and Turkey were enemies. In fact, they were great allies. And Prime Minister Erdogan, who's now actually President Erdogan, the emerging dictator in Turkey, was very, very friendly with Egypt. Well, since the Arab Spring and since the second Egyptian revolution, as I mentioned, that happened just a week after we were there, the Muslim Brotherhood was kicked out. And so now you have Sisi, who's taken over, and really just the past year or two, these two world leaders have been openly chiding each other back and forth, referring to each other as a dictator, and there's this incredible hostility that has emerged. And so while you could say this is sort of the beginning of the fulfillment of Daniel 11, you can see the contours of that end times landscape coming together. Mm-hmm. And as watchmen, this is what we're called to do, to watch for the signs of his coming.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about some of that, but I want to roll into it a set of verses we don't always talk about in terms of prophecy. What about Isaiah 19? And it talks about destruction and deterioration in Egypt. Is that related all to what's happening in Egypt in the Arab Spring? We'll talk more with Joel Richardson right about that right after this.
Did you catch Eric Holder on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos? He said the president is planning a summit to study those who, quote, corrupt the Islamic faith to justify terrorism. But since it was Muhammad himself leading the slaughter of men, women, and children for not bowing to Allah back in the 7th century, I wonder if they might discover who corrupted it back then. You know, it takes real effort to ignore the obvious, but it would seem our officials and many in the media make that effort. They can't see that those who take part in terrorist acts are following a straightforward interpretation of Muhammad's teachings and actions and all of the Quran. In a world of political correctness, Point of View Radio stands out. We seek the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and bring it to you daily. But we cannot be here without your support. Give online at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Joel Richardson and Times Eyewitness. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talked about some of the parts of that video, the rebirth of Israel, the rebuilding of the Jewish temple, false prophets, and the Islamic Messiah. And just a few minutes ago, we were talking about the book of Daniel and the Arab Spring, but I wanted to put one more on the table, if we could, for just a minute. And Joel, that's Isaiah 19 and Egypt. Now, if you look at Isaiah 19, it's an oracle. It talks about conflict. It talks about really kind of an economy that's in some kind of difficulty, Egyptians fighting against Egyptians, civil strife, religious tension. Most people, when they think of prophecies related to the end times, think of Matthew 24. They think of Ezekiel 38 and 39. They think of course, Daniel, which we just talked about, the book of Revelation. They don't necessarily think of Isaiah 19, but you and especially some of the people that you had a chance to interview felt that maybe you're seeing a fulfillment of that particular part of the book of Isaiah in terms of what has been happening in Egypt. Explain, if you might.
Yeah, well, one of the goals of the film was not merely to set forth what I see being fulfilled, but actually to set forth that which the believers throughout the Middle East, the prophecies they believe are now beginning to take place. And so as I traveled and interviewed various leaders throughout the Egyptian church, this was the passage that everyone pointed to, and they really believe that this is beginning to be fulfilled. And of course, I was also relieved when I sat down with Walter Kaiser and I said, "What do you think? Is this an eschatological end-time prophecy?" And he said, he's been working on this particular text for about the past 5 years, and he believes that it's beginning to be fulfilled. So, again, Walter C. Kaiser Jr., just a living legend today among Old Testament scholars,
yes.
And it was just an honor for me to be able to sit down with him. But when you look at the text, it begins with the Lord coming on the clouds. Now, this motif of the Lord coming on the clouds is later picked up throughout the New Testament, and this is one of the primary places that foundations for that picture of the Lord coming on the clouds. But then the oracle lays out a series of events that would take place in the last days, primarily around the nation of Egypt. The first one is civil war. Well, again, this is just now 2 years since the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Morsi, that nation has been in the midst of a beginning, early stages of a civil war. And, you ask anyone in Egypt, they say, absolutely, we're in a civil war, it's only getting worse. And when you look at Isaiah's prophecy, it clearly is progressive. It becomes more significant. But, there's bombings and terrorist attacks all across Egypt now on a regular basis. We hardly even hear about it in the Western media, but if you have your proper, Google search terms, I track with these things on a pretty regular basis. So that is something that's new, and it's beginning to unfold. The next element of the prophecy is the drying of the Nile, which results in the desolation of the economy, the Egyptian economy. Egypt is the largest, most populous Arab nation in the world, about 83 million people there. They primarily subsist from the Nile River. They always have. And so I go through some various issues, some of which have been, taking place now since the early 70s, such as the Aswan Dam. But I point out that there's another dam being built right now. One of the issues I don't touch on in the film is the fact that the Saudis are actually running out of their own fossil water reserves, and they've been buying up massive, massive tracts of land in Eritrea and Ethiopia, which is also an issue that's going to sort of come to a head in the next several years as the Nile River is diminished because water becomes scarce in desert regions. And so, of course, if the Nile were to even be diminished another 15-20%, Egypt already lives off of massive international welfare from the Saudis, Gulf Arabs, as well as the United States. If that river's diminished, it will desolate the economy. 83 million hungry and frustrated Egyptians is not something the world wants to deal with. These are things that we can see in the beginning stages right now, and I believe that will, again, come to a head the next 10 years. And then, as we mentioned, it talks about a cruel master.
Yes.
Is the next element of the text, which I believe is also tied into Daniel 11, as we just mentioned. I believe that Egypt will be invaded and actually conquered by the Antichrist. And we can see that enmity already between Egypt and the more radical Sunni regimes that are emerging in the north, and the nations such as Turkey as well, of course, and ISIS. And we're not sure exactly how that's going to look or where that's going to come from, but we can see that regional enmity taking shape. But then you have sort of a turn in the prophecy. This is where it begins to become very positive. It speaks of really an end-time prayer movement,
yes,
a cry that will rise up out of Egypt from the Egyptians. And what very few people know is that Egypt right now is really the home, despite the fact that there's such a minority of Christians in the nation, roughly 10, 11 million, to perhaps the most significant prayer movement, Christian prayer movement in the earth right now.
Right.
They regularly, in the Egyptian churches, will have prayer gatherings that will last all night long.
Mm-hmm.
They'll have 3,000 to 10,000 people gathering. They actually have to sell tickets to the prayer meetings. They're so popular. And, there's a lot that we can learn from the Egyptian church right now here in the States. But then the wonderful thing is, as a result of all this, it speaks of Egypt turning to the Lord in the last days before the return of Jesus, and then during the millennium. Of course, there's this strong contingency of Egyptians represented then is how the prophecy ends. All of these elements, Kerby, I believe that we're seeing the early stages of them right now. Again, they're not in their fullness, but we can clearly see the signs of the times aligning. When I was there with the Egyptian church, they were just ecstatic, despite the difficulties, despite the persecution, at the things that the Lord was doing. Everybody universal. I mean, they were happening that day that I was there. They said, we have never seen Muslims coming to faith like we have the past few months. And this was a year ago. Miraculous things, nominal Christians. The Lord is already beginning to move in Egypt.
I might just mention that one of the really powerful scenes in the video are those prayer gatherings. I hate to say it, but I'm not sure we could gather in the United States as many thousands as they've been able to gather for an all-night prayer vigil, but nevertheless, a very powerful scene there as well. I might mention that, as you mentioned a minute ago, you do interview people like Walt Kaiser, who used to be the president, Gordon Conwell, before that was Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and Jonathan Kahn, Chris Mitchell, who is the CBN Mid-East Bureau Chief. We mentioned Rabbi Yehuda Glick. Well, we're talking about prayer, Mike Bickle, as well as Alan Hood of the International House of Prayer, and really just an incredible number of people that you've interviewed, Messianic Jews, Christian pastors, others in places like Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, all sorts of different ways in which you've tried to bring together a lot of diverse voices. And so just before we take our next break, we've already talked about the turmoil in Egypt. We can't ignore something else, and that is the rise of Turkey. You had the Ottoman Empire, and at one point then when that kind of disbanded, the idea of Ataturk and others, you thought, well, here is a country that was already part of NATO. Some people thought at one point Turkey could have even been part of the EU. No longer, because with the dictator they have right now and the Islamic radicalism, Turkey, if anything, has become a dominant power, wants to reassert that caliphate, and it is about as radical as we've seen in any of the countries in the Middle East now.
11 years ago when I wrote Islamic Antichrist, I said, based on biblical prophecy, that in the years ahead, Turkey would reemerge as a regional power and an Islamist power. Now, again, just 11 years ago, everyone was saying Turkey is the model of secular, moderate Islamic nation. We want to replicate that throughout the Middle East. And I've watched as the AK party has risen in Turkey, and really they've had a soft coup to where, just like Iran had their Islamist revolution, Turkey has had the same thing. The Islamist party has taken over. In the film, we went to a AKP party rally all day when Erdogan got up and spoke, and I can't even convey to Americans the level of nationalism and nationalistic fervor that is emerging out of Turkey, this desire to revive the glory days of the Ottoman Empire, and it's mingled with Islamism. I genuinely felt, and I think I capture that in the video as well, I felt as though I was at the Zeppelin Tribune Field in early 1930s Germany with, Adolf Hitler getting up and giving his speeches. It was palpable. I mean, Americans can't even begin to understand the level of nationalism that is sweeping through the Islamist community there in Turkey. Prime Minister Erdogan, by the way, now again, President Erdogan, just 5 years ago, Obama was referring to him as the greatest, best friend America has in the Middle East. Well, just after we've got a break there.
Yeah, let's take a break. We'll give you a chance to finish your point, and we will make that point right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Joe Richardson with us for a few more minutes as we talk about End Times Eyewitness. And Joe, just before we went to the break, you were talking about Barack Obama and, of course, Erdogan and what is happening in Turkey right now. Please continue.
Well, essentially, after the shootings in Paris, Erdogan went to the rally, acted as though he was standing against terrorism, and then he went back to his own country. And he made the statement that he believed that Muslims they were not responsible for that, that actually it was France and the Israeli Mossad that carried that out and tried to make it look like it was Muslims. This is the kind of just crazy extremist rhetoric that has now become really normal for Erdogan. He has emerged as as a crazy dictator, and yet the nation is still part of NATO. It's a very disturbing reality.
Well, we certainly can talk a little more about that, but I thought I'd pick out at least two more real quickly because we've talked about Egypt and Turkey, but you also have a section there on the rise of ISIS and what is happening in Syria and Iraq. A lot of people have not really thought through the possible implications of ISIS and this Islamic State. But as you pointed out, if you start with an apocalyptic viewpoint, which certainly many of the leaders in ISIS have, then you can understand a lot of what is taking place right now in those two countries, can't you?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just point out that based on Daniel chapter 8 and 11, most of the early church, premillennialist writers, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Lactantius, Victorinus, they all believed that the Antichrist was going to emerge out of that region of Syria, Iraq, or Turkey, that sort of part of the world. And so it's certainly interesting that, these things are taking place in those nations. One of the things, too, that I'll just say sort of on a positive spin, there's also, tying in with Isaiah 19, it speaks of not just a revival in Egypt, but also in Assyria. And, of course, Assyria is basically the region that ISIS has just taken over.
Right.
And for that reason, I believe the Lord, despite what ISIS is doing, is going to do a great thing, primarily among the displaced peoples, the refugees. Now there's about 2 million spread throughout that region. I'm actually heading to northern Iraq here very shortly to minister. And from what I hear, there's revivals breaking out in the refugee camps because they've seen the true face of Islam. And so despite all that ISIS is doing, despite all that Satan's doing, the Lord raises up a standard as well. And so we need to recognize that biblical prophecy is not all doom and gloom. There's strategic information that we can gain from it to help as we're trying to fulfill our primary mandate, which is the proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom.
One other one I thought I'd just mention real quickly, and you have a whole section there on the rise of global anti-Semitism. I don't think anybody anticipated how virulent it would be, but we pointed out a while back, and then you document in the movie and the video as well, that now you have more Jews leaving France than any other country. I think Ukraine is number 2, but still, Europe, which used to be, at least after World War II, theoretically a safe haven for the Jews, not necessarily the case. And so whether you look at Europe, whether you look at Asia, whether you look at Africa, even looking in the United States, you recognize this global anti-Semitism that seems to be a fulfillment of prophecy as well.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'll use this opportunity to mention that I have a book that will be released here very shortly, the title of which is When a Jew Rules the World.
Wow.
And, I've written on this extensively, but essentially what we have is we have the satanic rage against the Abrahamic covenant, against the everlasting covenant, as it's sweeping throughout the nations. God himself made a promise unto death that he would give that land to the children of Abraham, to the children of Israel. And, throughout the nations, there's the controversy, and Satan is using men like puppets to affect his purposes, to thwart the plans of God. And so it's not just in the radical Islamic community, it's throughout Europe. The nations are turning against Israel. They said it would never happen again. The Bible says it would happen again before the return of Jesus. And it doesn't take anyone with the discernment of a log to recognize that Satan's sights are set on the people of Israel. And it proves God. It proves the validity of the Bible, and again, the validity of biblical prophecy, as these things are indeed surrounding us, and they're only going to increase.
Let me just mention, while we have a few minutes left, that first of all, they can go to and click on the picture and the link there to joelstrumpet.com. Of course, we also have a link to the video production. But if people wanted to get this particular documentary, it's a 70-minute DVD. They can order it from you. If they're interested in your new book or your previous books, you have a store at Joel's Trumpet so that they can find some of those resources. But talk about what is available to our listeners as they go to your website.
Well, yeah, I try to, give little updates and so forth and just sort of blog what I'm up to. would ask for your prayers, again, as we're getting ready to head to northern Iraq. But, we've got all sorts of resources, DVDs and books, which, it's my best humble effort to try to look at the testimony of the biblical prophets and shine a light on all that's unfolding in the earth for the purpose of urgency, the proclamation of the gospel, holiness. I believe that Jesus is, in fact, coming back soon, and I don't know how soon, but I do believe that we need to walk with that urgency that the early church walked in, and if we do so, I believe we can turn the world upside down.
Well, Joel, I appreciate you being on the program, and thank you again for your willingness to be out there on the front lines, especially in some pretty dangerous areas and some pretty provocative interviews, so that we could have a chance to sit back and watch End Times Eyewitness, and we thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks again for having me on.
We will do it again. Pray for his trip to Iraq and other places where he will be traveling that he probably could not even mention on the program. And again, I would commend to you this interview that he has done with a number of individuals, 70 minutes in which you have a chance not only to hear from some people that you would know who are experts in the field, professors and individuals that work as journalists with CBN and others, but also people that are Messianic Jews or pastors in some of these particular countries. But what I think is so striking is in a couple of cases to interview some pretty prominent individuals who are Muslim, and to hear the Muslims actually talk about this with just a sense of expectation that the Mahdi and the return of the Islamic Christ will bring in this new world caliphate, and how that could fit in certainly with end-time prophecy. So I hope you appreciated the conversation we had today with Joel Richardson, and you can find more about him at his website, and I certainly would encourage you to investigate that. In the first hour, of course, we also spent some time talking about the importance of Save the Mother, Save Her Child evangelism training. So we wanted you to have access to that as well. And so take the time each day to visit the website pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll also see my viewpoints in which I speak to many of the issues we are talking about today. We have our Take Action section. We also have our video series, which is called the Uncensored Video Series, and we will give you a chance to watch various videos to then maybe post them on your Facebook page or to send them to others, and it's a great way to equip people that you know in a very effective way. So it's all available at the website pointofview.net. We are really dedicated to educating you about these issues and certainly equipping you for these issues and empowering you to make a difference in the community. So I hope that on a regular basis, you will visit our website, pointofview.net. Take advantage of the resources that we have there, the articles, the videos, and other resources, because we want you to be effective in your community. That's all we have for today. I certainly want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
The Point of View radio talk show is broadcast 2 hours each day, but you can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. There you'll also be among the first to see our new videos, Uncensored, a series highlighting issues impacting this generation and the next. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. @PointOfViewRTS. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Together, let's go viral. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.